why have we become so obsessed with trying to create something that is, for the most part, naturally occurring to make a fake version of it? You know, it's like seeing, I mean, these companies, here's what they're doing. It's like seeing leaves on a tree and saying, you know what, those leaves, they clog your gutters. They're bad for the ground. They don't really, provide the proper nutrients into the soil. And so let's make fake leaves out of ice. Let's dive back into our conversation about Netflix's docuseries, You Are What You Eat, a Twin Experiment. Now, we finally finished all 4 episodes, and it feels a lot more like we got a lesson in factory farming than anything else. There was appalling imagery that we experienced in this film, but before we get into that, let's dive into the study done by Landry et al. It's titled Cardiometabolic Effects of Omnivorous versus Vegan Diets in Identical Twins, a randomized clinical trial.
Well, as we made mention of in our part 1, the most prominent name amongst all of the researchers, amongst those et al., which for those of you who are wondering, like, what the heck does et al. Mean? It means and others. So typically when you have these studies that are done, there's a prominent name, and then there's usually anywhere from 2 to maybe upwards of 10 other people involved in the research. But again, the most prominent name amongst them was Christopher Gardner, who has been a researcher for over 20 years and is very well accustomed to study design. And I'm emphasizing that because I want everybody to keep that in mind as we go a little bit deeper into this discussion about the study, because it's going to play a really big role in this. Other things to know about Christopher Gardner: he is the director of Stanford's plant-based initiative, which Nina Teichholz had reported was launched in 2021 with a 5-year grant by the meat replacement company Beyond Meat, whose CEO we also saw in this documentary. Now, I'm just going to take this right from Gardner's bio on the Stanford site. In the past few years, the interest of my research group has shifted to include 3 areas of inquiry. One of these is stealth nutrition. Now, that doesn't sound like the devious name, does it? Stealth nutrition. The central hypothesis driving this is that in order for more effective and impactful dietary improvements to be realized, health professionals need to consider adding non-health related approaches to their toolbox of strategies. Examples would be connections between food and 1, global warming and climate change, 2, animal rights and welfare, and 3, human labor abuses, i.e. slaughterhouses. An example is a summer food and farm camp run in collaboration with the Santa Clara Unified School District since 2011. Every year, around 125 kids, ages 5 to 14, come for a 1-week summer camp to tend, harvest, chop, cook, and eat vegetables and play because it's summer camp. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds like an absolutely horrible way to lose 1 week of summer vacay.
Cooking is fun.
His bio goes on to say, the objective is to study the factors influencing the behaviors and preferences that lead to maximizing vegetable consumption in kids. So basically, let's use this as an opportunity to cultivate the next generation of activists and people who are going to help drive our agenda.
Well, it's really interesting, right? I mean, listen, does this sound like a horrible thing? You're having kids come and planting and you're harvesting and you're cooking.
Sounds horrible to me.
It sounds horrible to you, but let me just say this. If that's all that they're doing, there's no harm. But you wonder, what is the curriculum? What is the education? What are the cognitive biases of those that are there instructing these kids? What are the camp counselors saying? Killing animals is bad. So there's always an underlying nefarious tone that can be brought into something like that. I mean, just look at public school education, and I'm not going to go down that vein right now, but there's more and more being exposed about the totally inappropriate education that's being given to our children in public school right now. They're not just learning reading and writing and math. So when I look at something like this as a former educator, I wonder, what is the narrative that's being presented to these kids while they're at camp?
Well, I mean, I think just even from this bio alone, it's pretty obvious. I mean, he outlines 3 things that we should be looking to focus on, aside from what food does with respect to our health. It's very evident that global warming and climate change is a big issue here. for them. It's evident that animal rights is a huge issue for them, and slaughterhouse is a huge issue. So the thing that I have most trouble with is that your job as a nutritional researcher and educator is to basically get to the crux of what is the best and healthiest way for us to eat. And if that's your focus, and you wind up discovering along the way that, hey, also by eating this way, not only is it better for our health, but it's also gonna help resolve some of these other issues, I'm good with that. The problem is that, as they explain here with stealth nutrition, it's not about the nutrition first. It's about the agenda first.
Well, and here's what I really wonder. Why have we become so obsessed with trying to create something that is, for the most part, naturally occurring to make a fake version of it? You know, it's like seeing, I mean, these companies, here's what they're doing. It's like seeing leaves on a tree and saying, you know what, those leaves, they clog your gutters. They're bad for the ground. They don't really, provide the proper nutrients into the soil. And so let's make fake leaves out of ice. And let's make that that's
something biodegradable.
Yes, it's something that, is something other than, and here's what's so interesting to me. I do a lot of my own shopping, our shopping, on an app, and these impossible meats, quote unquote, like, why are we calling them meat? They're not meat. Why can't we just call them plants, right? Because you're trying so hard to make a copy or replicate something that people enjoy. They're always on sale. They're always on freaking sale. I can't get steak on sale. I can't get ground beef on sale. Why is this stuff always on sale? It's because they can't sell it. And what's interesting too is this is actually available on welfare. So someone somewhere pulled some strings so that these impossible things, not all processed foods, not all freezer foods, not all things in the supermarket are eligible for SNAP benefits, yet these impossible meats are. So I thought that was just an interesting thing. Let's dive into though.
Yeah, let's get back to the study itself. So I had a couple more points that I just wanted to make regarding the study and involvement. And the study itself, I think we did make mention of this last episode. It was funded by the Voight Foundation, and that's a vegan advocacy group. And they support animal rights, animal rescue, veganism. They have never been shown to provide funding for anything other than those particular agendas. And Kyle Voight himself is a board member at a food tech company, or actually two food tech companies. One is Upside Foods and the other is Nobel Foods.
Well, let's dive into this then. What is it then that we know about these two companies?
Well, first, Upside Foods, they are a lab-grown meat company. And just for context, all this lab-grown meat is actually cultivated from animal cells.
So hold on. So you're telling me that we're not going to eat animals, but we need the cells from animals to make the plant meat?
Correct.
Okay.
So you can't kill the animal, but you could extract its cells and then make a counterfeit version of their meat.
Cool.
Regarding Nobel, well, on their site, I just actually had to write this down. I thought this was incredible. Nobel site, we make cheese that melts, bubbles, and stretches just like cheese from animals. Ours just happens to start with plants instead of animals. We take advantage of a plant's natural ability to make protein and teach it to make milk protein called casein, which is the protein responsible for giving cheese its stretchy, melty, and texture qualities. And we work with farmers to grow our plants in sun-drenched soil. Picture endless rows of plants growing in an open field, and that's where our cheese comes from. No, it actually comes from a lab. We then harvest the plants, separate out the casein, and make cheese from it the same way many cheeses are made. So you go through this entire process to create something that replicates cheese, but at the end of the day, is not cheese.
It's kind of interesting.
I find it fascinating. I really do. I mean, if anything came from watching the final episode, it was, you're going through these great lengths to make something that God has already provided for us.
Yeah.
And as much as they want to point back to greenhouse emissions and all of this stuff, it's like, look at all the production that's going into this food. But again, I digress. Let's stay on the task of talking about the study.
You want to know a quick fun fact?
Yeah, go for it.
Since 1961, 65 climate disasters have been predicted. Guess how many have come true? None. Okay, continue.
All right. Well, Zoe Harcombe, who was our guest on episode 108, where she debunked the Harvard research claiming red meat causes type 2 diabetes, wrote an incredible review of this twin study. And just here is the summary that she gave, and then I'd like us to just go back through and talk about some of these points in detail. So first, this trial involved 22 sets of identical twins, so 44 people. One of each twin was randomly allocated to an 8-week whole foods vegan diet and the other to an 8-week whole foods omnivorous diet. The time frame here is very important to understand. This was an 8-week study. It wasn't 12 weeks. It wasn't 6 months, it wasn't 1 year, it was 8 weeks. The participants may have been identical twins, but they weren't identical in characteristics. So remember from part 1, we talked about, wow, how fascinating, twins, they're identical, everything must be the same. Well, the fact of the matter is that things were not the same, and these differences were not adjusted for. Some baseline food intakes were also quite different between the two groups, notably grains and plant-based protein. Her next point, the diet was provided by the researchers for the first 4 weeks, and then participants provided their own food for the second 4 weeks. The main outcome of interest was the change in LDL cholesterol. Cholesterol did fall in the vegan group relative to the omnivorous group, but it would because the consumption of plant sterols increased in the vegan group. In the food delivery phase, the vegan groups were given an average of 345 calories fewer than baseline and nearly 200 fewer than the omnivore group. This calorie gap was largely maintained during the self-delivery phase. The vegan group lost a reported 1.9 kilograms, so that's 4 pounds, over the 8 weeks. The raw data showed the loss to be an actual 3-pound loss. Fasting insulin was reported to be 2.9 milliliters lower in the vegan group than the omnivore group. Both could easily be explained by the calorie and protein inequalities introduced in the trial. Next point, the paper claimed that vitamin B12 intake did not suffer. It was noticeably higher in those assigned to the vegan group at baseline, and vitamin B12 intake did not drop to 0 during the trial, indicating that fortified foods were being consumed. I know I'm giving a lot right now, but we will go back through this and explain this in detail because once we do, you're going to be fascinated. Okay. Last 2 points. Longer-term impact of deficiencies in essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, and vitamins and minerals in the form that the body wants them could not be ascertained during an 8-week trial. So remember what I just said moments ago. 8 weeks was a critical aspect of this study, that it's not enough time for a lot of the physiological changes that would take place from changing your diet to actually occur. Yeah. At least not in a significant way. At least not in a significant manner. Lastly, had calories and plant sterol intake been identical during the trial, I hypothesize, this is Dr. Harcombe, that no differences in outcomes would have been observed, except diet satisfaction, which decreased on every scale bar for the vegans.
So basically, the vegans were not very happy with what it is that they were eating.
No.
Here's the thing that I think is crazy, though. Again, coming from a fitness viewpoint, why are we having 200 less calories per vegan group than the omnivore group?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's a really good question, and
well, I know that fat loss was not the main aim of this study. They weren't looking, but they also didn't discourage fat loss. And I know we're going to get into all the exercise and everything else. But if you're designing a study that's aiming to take identical people and give them identical diets, so to speak, of different, what am I looking for? Composition, right? Mm-hmm. One is meat and then one is just vegetables and beans. It's so interesting to me. Obviously, consuming less calories is going to lead to some form of calorie deficit, which could result in weight loss. And we'll talk more about what the composition of that weight was.
But I mean, to that point too, what's incredible is that when you're trying to do a study on nutrition, you're trying to control as many variables as possible, which means that you would not necessarily introduce exercise into this equation unless you were trying to either cover up certain deficiencies and ensure that some positive results are seen, or you're trying to encourage something such as weight loss or muscle gain during the trial.
Well, can we just go into exactly what we saw in these 4 sets of twins that were actually shown on the series?
Sure.
Because again, you have 44 people, but you're only showing 8 on this 4-episode series. And what happened is, of the 4 sets of twins, 3 lost muscle mass. And the crazy thing is, the researcher, the fitness professionals, right, that they had there, they were like, well, you should have lifted more weights. And I'm like, so hold on a second. Should the diet then be attributed for the changes in body composition, or was it the exercise? I mean, to your point, it's crazy to throw that variable in and then point to vegan diet is better. These people all had a loss in muscle mass. I mean, that's insane.
At least of the
to
ones
me.
they showed. And
True.
I thought that was incredible. But going back to the point around 8 weeks, so Nina Teicholz had summed up the reason really nicely in her article. She had said, 8 weeks is far too short to establish the longer-term risks and benefits of a vegan diet. All of Gardner's previous diet trials have been of longer duration. So let's go back to Gardner. He's been doing experiments since 2006, and he's an expert in conducting trials. His first study that was called A to Z lasted, get this, 1 year, and reported in 2007 that the Atkins diet was superior to 3 others: Ornish, Learn, and Zone. Subjects on the Atkins plan lost significant more weight and had superior outcomes for markers of cardiovascular and metabolic health. Since then, Gardner has reduced the low carbohydrate advantage in his studies by counseling subjects simply to avoid sugar and white flour in both study groups, for instance, as he did in the Diet Fits trial. So, quick little interjection here. The Diet Fits study was randomized of 609 men and women to either a healthy low carb or a healthy low fat diet, and then examined weight loss and other measures over the course of a, again, 12-month period. The diet started off genuinely low carb and low fat for 8 weeks, which meant that there was 20 grams of carbohydrates for the low carb group each day, or 20 grams of fat each day for the low fat group. But after that, participants were advised to just move to the level of carbs and fat intake that they believed that they could sustain for the trial. So you can see how just like one little suggestion can make a huge impact on the results. And I just find it fascinating that all the other trials that he's done previously were these really lengthy ones where all of the nuances would play out over time and things would finally fall to a baseline that could be measured. And now in this 8-week trial, you don't even give it that opportunity.
Well, let's just be honest. How big is your budget for a reality TV show?
This is true. And what do you have to show in that reality TV show in order to keep eyes on the show? Just going further, in the Keto Med diet trial, which had primary outcome of average blood sugar, so A1C for diabetes, Gardner had the participants in the keto group stop all their A1C lowering medications during the trial, while those on the low-carb Mediterranean diet only halved theirs. So a difference that gave this Mediterranean diet group a distinct advantage. Still, what's cool is that the groups still had virtually equal outcomes.
Wow.
So again, further just showing that the low carbohydrate approach actually works significantly well. So Nina Teicholz had basically said, from all of this evidence, you can see that Gardner knows what he's doing. This is not a stupid man, and could it be possible that Gardner, with his vegan funding, with a Netflix docuseries on the line, was very intentional about keeping the time frame very small and being able to control and balance a lot of the narrative and the factors that went into this? I mean, I think it's a legitimate question to ask.
Well, and cherry pick the evidence that's shown in just 10 minutes of the final of 4 episodes. You know, here's our study results. There were different measures that they didn't go into. And I think one of the most fascinating is that bone density over time has been proven to decrease. There's a greater risk of fracture and break in bones of those on vegan diets. So longer term, yeah, he might have run into some challenges. I read this in an article and I just think that this line was great. It's a documentary directed by a vegan, based on a study done by a vegan, who directs a program funded by vegan food, somehow miraculously comes to the conclusion that we should all be vegans.
That's unbelievable. Well, listen, let's talk about, again, a few more flaws with just this study setup, the way it was designed. If enough people are randomized in a study, there should be no differences in their characteristics. So again, you know, Zoe had pointed out that even though we're talking about identical twins, they were not exactly identical in terms of their characteristics. And when you do a randomized control study, what should wind up happening, and this was what was shown in the Diet Fit study, they did a great job of randomizing those 609 men and women. And at the start of that study, when you compared the two groups to one another, what you saw is that everything averaged out. But in this case, things did not average out. So this study included just 44 people. They were identical twins, so allocating one twin to each group should have made the averages identical. But the participants, even though they were identical twins, there were 17 women and 5 men in each group, and the average age was 39. Those characteristics remain the same, but other characteristics did display differences. Males assigned to the omnivore diet were on average 9 pounds heavier than their twin assigned to the vegan diet. Systolic blood pressure was higher on average in the omnivore. HDL, LDL, and triglycerides were all higher at baseline in the omnivore, and B12 was higher in the vegans at baseline.
Hold on, I want to go into that. Why though, B12? It's because vegan diets are devoid of B12 vitamins. So even though this was randomized, let's put the people that already have higher B12 in the group where they're not consuming B12, so at the end of it, we can show that there was not a significant loss in B12. That, to me, is disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it pretty evident that you're giving them a running head start, is what it is. You know it's going to drop. You know it's going to come down, but if it doesn't come down significantly because it's only an 8-week study, it's very hard to point to that, something that we know over time does happen with people who are following a vegan or vegetarian diet. So next, because this was a randomized controlled trial, none of these differences were adjusted for. It's assumed that in an RCT, that the randomization itself evens out any differences. These groups were not even at baseline. So again, is this just coincidence or is this intentional?
You better watch out. You're starting to sound like me.
I know. Let's talk a little bit about fat loss. So you had brought up this point before. Why are these calories so much lower? Well, the researchers stated in their paper that our diet design did not include a prescribed energy restriction and was not intended to be a weight loss study. But they also stated that weight loss was not discouraged. That said, meanwhile, the film trailer shows multiple scenes of the twins working out, and more importantly, the vegan groups were given 345 less calories when they started the food delivery stage, and omnivores receiving only 137 calories less. And these deficits hardly changed when both groups moved to self-provided food stages of the study. So you put somebody in a deeper caloric deficit, even though you put the other group in a deficit as well, and then that difference carries on for the course of 8 weeks. Should we see a drop in weight for the vegan group compared to the omnivore group in this case? You absolutely should. I just thought it was interesting that in the film, when they were doing the body composition testing, which was accounting not just for the changes in body weight, but was actually factoring in loss of muscle, loss of fat, or increases in muscle or increases in fat, that vegan group, all of them lost muscle.
Yeah.
And one thing that we both pointed out, though, is that even though the increases in muscle mass were significant for the omnivores, the truth is those omnivores would not have seen an increase in muscle had they not been weight training. And that was also a major difference. I think there was just one group of twins, it was those young guys who the vegan actually did put on muscle, but compared to his brother, it was like insignificant. He put on 2.9 pounds of muscle, which for all intents and purposes is awesome, but his brother put on like 7.7 pounds of muscle. I mean, that's a huge difference, but neither of them would have seen that difference had they not been resistance training.
Well, just take that though for a minute. Both of those young twins, who I think they were at their college graduation, so they're young, they're athletic, they're in their prime for muscle building. One puts on, what did we say, 2.9,
I think 2.9 pounds.
Okay, and the other put on, I think it was 7.1 was the amount. So to eat then a omnivorous diet, you're looking at putting on plus 5 pounds of muscle mass compared to your brother.
Doing the same workout routine.
Exactly. So it's all how you position the data.
All right, so some of the other nutritional differences that were pointed out, dietary cholesterol was 0 for the vegan group, but we know that dietary cholesterol doesn't impact blood cholesterol and has been proven numerous times in studies that date back to 2014. Meaning that even though we're consuming dietary cholesterol, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see significant increases in cholesterol, especially to the degree in which it's going to impact our heart health.
Can we just break that down then for a third grade level? So that means that eating eggs and bacon, which contain cholesterol in the food, is not a direct impact on your cholesterol in your blood when you go for blood work.
Correct. Okay. Dietary vitamin B, again, that should have been 0 in the vegan diet, since B12 is only found in animal foods, as you already pointed out. Yet the vegan diet had 1.2 micrograms per day, which means that they were eating fortified foods, which for the purpose of this study would be considered cheating. So this is Zoe Harcombe who's saying this. This is her area of expertise. She takes the data, she looks at it, she understands nutrition, and what she's saying is that there is no way that these vitamin B12 levels would have been what they were unless the foods that they were eating were fortified with vitamin B12, which was probably very much the case, especially during the food delivery phase of this.
Well, this reminds me a lot of the Game Changers. Wasn't it that the Game Changers were eating this whole vegan diet, but they were supplementing with all of these supplements to make up for what was missing? Or even, let's just take someone on the meat eater side. Look at, what was it, Carnivore King? What was his name? Liver King.
Oh, Liver King.
Liver King. You know, this guy was totally ripped and jacked, and people are like, wow, he gets that way from eating meat. No, this guy was supplementing with steroids, you know? So you can lie on both sides of the aisle, but I think that that's something to consider as a viewer.
Well, and similar to what we see in B12, there were increases in iron seen in the vegan group, which again could have only happened if they were consuming fortified foods and really increased the amount of legumes and dark leafy green vegetables that they were eating. However, only meat and fish contain iron that's highly bioavailable. So we know that heme iron, which is the best form of iron for us, is only found in animal proteins. So even if iron was higher in the vegan group, it's less likely that it was even available to the body. And that's always the big question, is people concern themselves with how much is in this thing versus that thing, when the question should be asking, how much of this will I absorb consuming this type of food versus that type of food? So lastly, nutrients that weren't reported but would be adversely affected by the vegan diet includes essential fatty acids, essential amino acids, vitamin D, calcium, and zinc. So many things that were missing, and as we saw when they were reporting on the results, many of the results were missing. So I think next we should probably dive into the results.
Well, and let's just go into that though. You know, calcium being something that we as a society have said calcium's so important. Remember the milk campaign? You know, here's something that comes from PubMed, and they did a study at Oxford that said that a risk for bone fracture at all sites combined was 11% higher in vegetarians than meat eaters. And then after the adjustment, they saw larger differences for hip fractures. Vegetarian had a 34% higher risk for hip fracture. And then the other thing that I saw that was so fascinating is that, sorry, I didn't have this ready. In vegans, the risk for all fractures before and after adjustment for BMI were 50 and 43% higher respectively, while the risks for hip fracture were 164 and 131% higher respectively. So, you know, we're not getting the things that we need from this thing, which again points back to your and Dr. Harcombe's points that this had to be an 8-week study. We couldn't have gone longer than this because you start to show people that, you know, you're gonna have a higher risk of fracture. Also in this PubMed study, there's higher risk of stroke, which we're not going to get into right now, but you start to look at the long-term implications, and I think that this series does a total disservice to people when it really comes to long-term impacts of our diet.
And just to piggyback off of that, I mean, there were so many outcomes and results that they started talking about by the end of this show and claiming these things to be definitive. You know, such as it's definitive that a vegetarian diet leads to a longer lifespan. And these things are not true. I mean, researchers are constantly trying to determine these things, and they're doing multiple trials, and they're trying to do them over long periods of time, which none of this is very easy to do. I mean, let me just take a step back. As critical as I and others can be on some of the research, conducting research is not easy because humans are problematic. And we saw that even in this, and it was even shown within the documentary itself that even though people are given all the steps to take, not everybody follows through on them. So how can you make a definitive statement that doing this is better than doing that? And listen, I'll argue the same on the carnivore side. There are influencers that are going out there saying that it's definitive, carnivore leads to a longer lifespan, and that's not necessarily true because there is nothing to show for that. And there are so many other environmental factors involved in all this. And by environmental, I mean like the environment we create for ourselves, not just where we're living. And unless all of that is controlled for, which is nearly impossible to do, I mean, I'm not even saying nearly, it is impossible to do, we're never gonna get definitive anything when it comes to our nutrition probably. So I think that the tack that most of us have to take is figure out which way of eating helps me to live a lifestyle that I can enjoy and makes me feel good. And when I do get my markers checked, everything seems to be moving in the right direction or is stable or my ratios are proper. I mean, that's where the focus really needs to be.
Well, and I'm just going to say, one of the best markers is your energy. If your own energy is at a good level, you wake up in the morning and you feel good, that's a great marker. If you're constantly tired and constantly fatigued, which we wondered in some of these vegan twins, were they just too exhausted to go to the gym and lift weights because they didn't feel good? Listen, that's how I felt being 2 years on the vegetarian diet. I was exhausted, and when I reintroduced animal protein, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so much stronger. So there's that. The other thing I wanted to point to was the TMAO, because that was a big thing. This creates more inflammation, and the meat eaters, the omnivores, they had higher levels of TMAO. But I went into PubMed and started looking up what is TMAO, which is trimethylamine N oxide. It's basically an amine oxide generated from animal meats. And basically what it says in this study is that despite the accumulating evidence, it's questioned whether TMAO is the mediator of a bystander in the disease process. It's important to basically perform more studies, yet it was definitive in this Netflix series that if you have higher TMAO, it is absolutely because of your diet and is absolutely creating inflammation in your body, and that is from the omnivore diet, period, end of story. And when you actually go in, and again, who has time to do this? That's why we're doing this for you guys, but who has time to do this, to go in and actually look? There is not definitive evidence that this is the marker and this is what it means. So more BS.
Yeah, it's troubling because anybody who's watching the series is going to just simply take it at face value that this must be true and not really have the truth presented to them. So to me, it's sad. Just a few other things regarding the results. So the main focus was the difference in LDL cholesterol, and that dropped significantly for the vegan group, which is to be expected because of the plant sterols, which replace cholesterol. And they also had a reduction in fasting insulin in addition to their reduced body weight. There was virtually no change, however, in HDL, triglyceride levels, or glucose. Now, I'm going to just pause on that one for a moment because remember, we've had other guests on here who have pointed to the fact, cardiologists in fact, who've pointed to our metabolic health being the most important thing, that we take a lot of these numbers sometimes out of context. We focus in, just as they did in this series, on LDL, which you're extracting this one result and trying to harp on that, which if you take the diet heart hypothesis as being truth, which it's already been disproven, well then you could keep pointing to LDL and saying, you see, this is better. But not taking, again, everything into account, the fact that glucose levels did not change, that's not a good thing. Glucose levels should change if a diet is truly superior to another. And that changing glucose as well as insulin levels is going to point to better metabolic health. We also have talked to others who've mentioned that it's not just this absolute number when it comes to your LDLs. It really is the ratio of LDLs to HDLs to triglycerides. And none of that was accounted for in here. The only thing they said was LDL is the bad cholesterol. And that lowered with a vegan diet.
Well, let's just look at triglycerides. That's a great marker of inflammation, and yet we talk about TMAOs and we scare the participants into, if you're on this omnivorous diet, your TMAOs are very high. Yet if we look at another marker of inflammation, which is triglycerides, that it didn't change. But let's not mention that.
Well, and I love, again, how Dr. Harcombe really summed it up. She said, the claims by Stanford that the vegan diet improves cardiovascular health is completely unfounded. It simply proved what the researchers themselves already knew, that plant sterols lower cholesterol. Meanwhile, research done by Harcombe and others has shown that plant sterols are more likely to worsen cardiovascular health and increase the risk of cancer. And so I went to, again, Dr. Harcombe's site and researched that paper that they had, and they did an incredible analysis based on research that had already been done over the course of decades, showing that these increases in plant sterols, that replacing cholesterol, were actually better indicators of risk for cardiovascular disease and cancer than having lower cholesterol.
Wow.
So it's incredible. And then, as Harcombe stated in her research review, the difference in body weight can be explained by giving the vegan group an average of 345 calories fewer than they had been eating, and nearly 200 fewer than the omnivores were given during the food delivery phase and maintained during the self-delivery phase. The fasting insulin difference could be explained by lower calorie intake and or lower protein intake in the vegan group. And so what's important here to realize about insulin is protein still has an impact on insulin. And a lot of people forget about that. They think, just about insulin with respect to carbohydrates, which is true. We get the largest spikes in insulin from eating carbohydrates, but insulin can still be raised via the consumption of protein. And the omnivore group, they consume more protein, and they consume more than they had at baseline. Again, which is another important factor. They were only eating so much protein to start, and now they're eating more protein. So that would cause a little bit more of a rise in their insulin. Not surprising, though, to anyone, is that the diet satisfaction scores decreased on 5 of the 6 scales for the vegan group. So in the omnivore group, it either increased, people were really happy with eating the way they were eating, or it remained the same. And of all the participants, there was only one that said that they would continue with the vegan diet. So you have 44 participants, and you can only find one person.
2% of all participants, if we're talking about percents.
Yeah, I like the absolute number. It's like, are you kidding me? Like 1 out of 44 people said, this is so great, I'm gonna continue with it. Yeah. However, in the film, they highlighted these people making an attempt to live a more plant-based lifestyle after the study was over. So again, I'll just finish up with what Zoe had said. After assessing the strengths and limitations of the study, she concluded that it was a waste of much time, effort, and money, that from a research perspective, it didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. From a narrative perspective, it adds to the body of literature claiming that plant-based diets are better than omnivore diets. Nutritionally, the opposite is true.
Wow. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, when you look at the study, though, it's pretty obvious. But we never get to see the study. And when I say that, we can go and search the study. But what most of us are shown are headlines, and then we're shown these limited series documentaries or documentary films, and we're told, hey, don't worry about the details. Let us boil that down for you. And it's conveniently packed into a narrative that has nothing to do with the health of individuals. And I'll be honest, for my money, I could not believe that they actually did highlight the differences in muscle mass and fat loss of the omnivores versus the vegans, but I just loved how they tried to spin it at the end, where they had one of the students presenting to all the twins about all of the results of the study, and they started pointing to telomere length and saying that, oh, well, the vegan group, though, they maintained or improved their telomere length. And the omnivore group, it stayed the same.
But here's what was crazy and actually pissed me off is they didn't tell you the numbers of improvement. There was no number given. It was just a chart, and it was just a little thing that said statistically significant, which for those in research, it's 0.01% proves statistical significance, but they never gave an amount. And I thought that was really interesting as well. And again, how do you really measure telomere length, which is, it's the caps on the ends of your DNA that it's like the ends of, on your shoelace. It's like those plastic caps, right? And what that's been shown to prove, there was a Nobel Prize awarded over this, is that we'll have longer lives. But here's what's crazy to me. First of all, what was the baseline? Can you really change that over 8 weeks? That seems unlikely to me. But then beyond that, okay, so in this vegan or vegetarian group, we're going to have longer telomeres, which could show that we're going to have longer lives, but they didn't point to, but you're probably going to have more bone breaks, more hip breaks, higher risk of stroke, less B vitamins, less calcium, less iron, but you're going to live longer. It'll just be in a nursing home.
But let's go back to the other issue here, is that this was not a true study in the sense that you want to point now to telomere length and say that, well, it's shown that the vegan group, right, has longer telomeres and the omnivore group does not, yet what about all the other factors involved? What about the exercise?
Yeah.
What about the fact that these groups were not even at baseline? And now you're going to go and just point to these two things. You're going to say the telomere length and LDLs were improved, but you're going to forget about all the other factors. And let's just say one more thing about telomeres. It may be an indicator of lifespan, but it's not an indicator of health span.
Agree.
And at the end of the day, when we finally shut this thing off, which I couldn't have been happier that it was finally over, when we shut it off, the first thing that I thought about was the fact that even if this group had supposedly now improved their lifespan, what is their health span? Like, is the quality of their life better because of this? And the fact that, again, even though it's swayed because they added exercise in, but if you're going to tell me that my diet in conjunction with my exercise, eating this one way is going to result in me losing more body fat, carrying more muscle mass, which we know muscle is the most important organ in our body. If it's going to do that, then I will take that over a few extra years of life because I know that I am going to live a more fulfilling life if I'm carrying more muscle, if I'm leaner, if I'm generally speaking, have all the signs of better health. I mean, to me, that is far more important. So you're going to tell me that now I'm going to try to eat more plant-based because I want to try to improve this one marker, which, again, even though we know that it was a Nobel Prize winner that uncovered telomeres, since then, it's also been shown that it is not a definitive way of determining length of life. And the truth is,
Health.
You might go step outside and get hit by a bus. So your telomere length really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But how you're living up to that point, that matters.
Well, I chuckled when you said that, that you'd rather have a few less years life, but it's, we look at peers who have parents and grandparents that are aging, and it is painful when you're not healthy. It is painful. So, I think the one thing that you can take from this series is the benefits of resistance training. We definitely saw it. There was an increase in muscle mass among people who resistance trained. So I think to that point, that was one good part that we could take out of these 4 episodes of wasted time. There's 2 other things that I wanted to point to. The first thing was, I really viewed this as a big science experiment, not really a study. There's no long-term study for any of this. But the gut bacteria, this has been something for me personally, being somebody who struggled with IBS, that they said the vegans had much more diverse gut bacteria, and they looked specifically at bifidobacterium. And to that point, here's what I'll say. When you're making drastic changes in your diet, your gut is going to produce different bacteria and different food in your own gut. So you're taking an omnivore that stays an omnivore. We're not going to see great diversity from baseline because you're eating the same darn thing. But when you take an omnivore and now you say you're eating all different types of plants and probably a greater variety of plants, now we have more diverse microbiome. Well, that's a given. You know, it's like taking a vegan and now feeding them tons of meat. Guess what? They're going to have greater diversity in their microbiome as well. So I thought that that was another really false point.
Well, I think that we're going to have to come back and definitely do one more part to this because there are still things that we have not discussed that are very specific to the film. I think today, hopefully, we did right by explaining the study and also presenting you the information and the feedback of those who research the researchers and give you a better understanding of what this study actually showed despite what you might be seeing during this series. But when we come back, I think there were a lot of things that were just very interesting that are worth discussing. Things related to sexual arousal. Again, you covered a little bit of the microbiome, but even just getting a little bit deeper into what was presented as far as how food is harvested and the processes and what you're actually seeing from a cinematography point of view. It's important because if you don't realize this, then it is very easy to be swayed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage everybody that, when you're talking to friends or family members who bring up this documentary and say, have you seen this? I'm thinking about changing everything that I do. We should all be eating vegan. This is the right thing to do for the environment and for animal welfare. I'm going to ask that you share these episodes with them and just give them a different point of view. We're not here to sway anybody, but I think it's only fair that people get to hear all sides of the argument. And if there's anything that was definitely missing from this series, it's very evident that there was no one on the other side to be able to counter anything that was being presented. But of course, that was all by design.